Hi there, Brian here. I recently asked in an online poll what content you would like to see me paint next. The overall winner was to paint my chaplain on a bike and my death company officers. So I thought I would start a new series on painting black power armour, and of course, the biker chaplain is the perfect model to start with. This poor guy has been sitting in a box for months, so I think it's really good that he's been chosen by all of you. Now, this is the most detailed model I've ever painted, but it's also the most detailed model I've ever painted on camera. So I wanted to apologise for a few things in advance. First, you may be seeing a lot of these in the shots. These are my new trusty magnifying glasses. I've only had them a few weeks, but these have been an absolute life changer when it comes to painting in tiny detail. I'm honestly not sure how I coped without them. My camera setup is limited by space, so these may come into view from time to time. And second, because this video was quite a bit longer than my normal uploads, I haven't gone into a lot of depth on how to paint things I've already covered in previous videos. So keep a lookout for the cards in the top right, where I'll be linking any relevant previous videos. I've tried to stick to things that are unique to this model and paint the rider and the bike separately. That means that there will be better chapter markers to help you skip ahead or skip the parts that you don't need. And as always, if you find this video useful or interesting, please consider liking or subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. Now, this video is going to be long enough, so let's get started. I have here my miniature primed and in a sub-assembly. Now, I'm not generally a fan of sub-assemblies, but in order to do this model justice, this really was my only option. I have covered up his joints with blue tack. This is so that I can use plastic glue to assemble him later on. Super glue can be a little bit too fast drying for me at times, and of course it leaves that weird vapour residue, which against black is going to be really noticeable. So to start, I give the model a quick coat of Vallejo Game Black. I've thinned this about 3 or 4 drops of thinner to 1 drop of paint. This is to ensure that I have a matching black with which to cover up any mistakes that I might make later on. It only takes 1 coat, so don't lay it on too thick. I want my chaplain to stand out a little bit against the black, so I'm going to be painting him with the same method that I've used on my Primaris Chaplin. It's a subtle effect that's going to give his armour a very slight hint of green, and it's one that I've modified from a recipe on a fellow YouTube channel called The Cult of Paint. Now, Henry from Cult of Paint very kindly gave me permission to credit them and mention them in this video. I've also posted a link in the video description below to their original recipe. But seriously, check their channel out. I'm sure many of you already have. They are the sole reason I've got back into painting 40k. Now, as I mentioned, this is a modified recipe, and that means I'll be using a slightly different colour of paint. I'm going to be using Vallejo Dark Sea Blue, thinned with about 2 drops of paint to 10 drops of thinner. This is a darker colour than the one used in the original recipe, only because I want to give the chaplain a slightly off-black tint to his armour, rather than giving him a strong highlight. Now, I'm spraying this at about 10 to 15 psi because it's so thin, and I'm gently spraying on even layers where the light would catch, on only the most forward-facing parts of the armour, leaving the rest black. All I'm trying to do is create a slight sheen or hint of green at this stage. This is about, say, 4 layers worth. Next, I take the same thinned mixture of Dark Sea Blue, but add in 2 drops of Vallejo Game Bone White. I'm spraying here at about 20 psi because of the thicker paint mix, or you can thin it down again and keep to the low pressure. I try to apply the highlights tighter and within the boundaries of the first layer of Dark Sea Blue. On the backpack, it's really quite easy to apply these as spot highlights. But for the rest of the armour, due to the ornate trim, it's really just easier to draw this on a line. There's nowhere to really place a good spot highlight due to that trim, and that's why I modified the recipe in this way. Now, to bring that highlight back so it isn't too strong, I'm going to give the model a wash all over with Vallejo Game Black. Now, I've thinned this really heavily, about 18 or 20 drops of thinner to 1 drop of paint. Of course, if you have the airbrush version of this paint, you'll only need to thin that to about 10 drops of thinner to 1 drop of paint. Lowering my PSI back to 15, I apply this evenly and all over the mini. It's really important to take your time here and be patient. Let each layer dry before applying the next. And try to count how many layers you apply on both sides so it stays even. Also, don't be afraid to tilt the Mini and get that wash into the shadows. Like all glazing, this is very subtle, and it obviously builds up in layers, but because it's black, it can go from 0 to 100 very quick, and you might suddenly find that your highlights are just gone. In fact, sometimes it's good to take a break and study something else before going back and applying your next layer. But just get it to a stage that you're happy with, and I'm very happy with this. I'm trying to simulate a kind of a two-tone look, armour that looks black in a normal light, but if the sunlight were to hit it, it would have this green shimmer to it. I know I keep saying it's subtle, but it does help set the rider and the bike apart, and helps make it look a little bit more interesting than if they were just both painted black. Now I give the bike and the rider a coat of Vallejo polyurethane gloss varnish, and allow that to cure for about an hour. This is just to protect the Mini, so that if I make any mistakes I can quickly rub the paint off and protect my paint layer. On the rider, I start by painting in the bone details with Citadel Base Wraith Bone. Although this is a base paint, it's not got amazing coverage, and the gloss varnish also makes it very difficult for the first layer to adhere to the surface. So my first layer is going to be very thin, almost a wash, and this gives the next layer of paint something to stick to. That way I can build up to a nice solid base coat. This took me about 3 layers of paint. I used the same method for painting all the skull details on both the rider and the bike later on. For the parchments I use Citadel Base Rakarth Flesh. And just like Wraithbone, apply this in thin layers and build it up to a nice solid coat. The wax seals I painted with a combination of Citadel Mephiston Red and Vallejo Heavy Violet to give it some variety in colour. The Crozius handle and the bike handles got a simple coat of Citadel Base Corn Red. Next I painted in all the leather details with Citadel Base Rhinox Hide. This paint has great coverage, so you only need 1 layer here. Just a quick reminder that the Chaplin's build is in 2 parts. I almost missed this bit on the bike. For the shoulder pad I just gave that a coat of Citadel Base Mephiston Red. Trying to be careful as I paint around the Blood Angel's emblem. I got these from Etsy. I don't want to name the seller just now in case they get some unwanted attention from a certain legal team, but you can find these easily by searching for the term Blood Legion. With all that done, I move on to the armour trim, and this is where I've made my first mistake. I used Scale 75's Black Gold, but I later realised it was a little bit too dark once I started to apply the shades and the washes. So I ended up having to highlight this about 3 times later on in order to fix that. So I'd recommend that you actually start with a brighter gold such as Scale 75's Viking Gold and save yourself the time. Of course, you might like this darker gold look, so I decided not to edit it out, and that way you can decide for yourself. And here's an example of why the gloss coat varnish is so important. I got some Necro gold onto the backpack, but I was able to very quickly scrape it off with a wet brush. Now that varnish layer did come off too, but as you can see the paint underneath is protected, and I can use some varnish later on to unify the texture. Using some Vallejo Game Black, I paint in the bellowing of the black carapace to add some definition and separation of the armour plates. I then give the shoulder emblem a coat of Vallejo Metal Dark Aluminium. And the blood drop gets a thin coat of Citadel Corax White. Then finally, give the gem a coat of Citadel Contrast Flesh Terrors Red. To highlight gems like this, please check out my Blood Gems and Bolters video, which I'll link in the top right. Moving on to the bike, I started with the metallics first, and using Scale 75 Necro Gold, painted in the starburst patterns on the side. This is where that black base coat came in really handy. The paint had overspilled, and as you can see here I had to tidy it up a bit. Once again, a coat of gloss varnish is going to help unify this later on. Now, to add some variety, again, I've painted in the exhaust pipes and foot pedals with Scale 75 Black Metal. but the bolters, chains, forks and wheels all get a coat of Vallejo metal dark aluminium. This is to match the rest of my army. Now this is an airbrush paint, so do be careful and wipe off any excess from your brush, because it will overspill very easily. The exhaust plate was painted with Vallejo Game Brassy Brass. Now this paint didn't like the gloss varnish either, and it left an awful lot of brush strokes. So once again I had to apply a very thin primary coat before laying down a second. And that gave me a nice solid finish. Moving on to normal colours now, I gave the bolter casings a coat of Citadel Base Corn Red. In hindsight, it would have been much easier to do this before the metallics, but I do find it harder to cover up a mistake with a metallic colour. While it's a little bit more hassle, personally I find it a little bit safer. I gave the skulls 1 or 2 coats of Citadel Base Wraithbone, as I mentioned earlier. And the book pages get a coat of Citadel Base Rakarth Flesh. For the book cover, I wanted to give it a really nice, rich red leather look, rather than just paint it brown with Rhinox hide. I thought that was boring. So I mixed in some Vallejo Heavy Sienna and Citadel Contrast Sigvald Burgundy. The ratio was around 1 drop of Sienna to 3 brushfuls of Burgundy, using a size 2 brush. I tested it on this map case on the side of the bike, and once happy, I went ahead and applied that to the book too. I'm sure there's already a pre-made paint in this colour somewhere, but I just didn't have anything like it in my collection. Finally, I painted parts like the holster, bookmark, seat padding, and the rider's pouches in Citadel Base Rhinox hide, while also forgetting to press record on my camera as I was doing it. So all I've got is this progress shot. So before I move on to the oil washing stage, I want to give some of these items a wash with standard Citadel shades and contrast on both the rider and the bike. Although I am going to be using oil washes, I'm doing this because I want to make some of the items look the same across all of my army. So for example, all the leather items and the book get a coat of Agrax Earthshade. The silver parts get a coat of Nuln Oil. And the copper and gold get a coat of Contrast Guilliman Flesh, to add some warmth and richness. And this is where I realised that Necro Gold was just a little too dark for my taste. It's not a huge mistake, but it's a bit of a waste of time, and it meant that I needed to do some extra highlighting later on. With all that complete, I go ahead and give both sections another coat of Vallejo Polyurethane Gloss Varnish. As you can see here, this has helped to unify any areas where the varnish was removed or any mistakes were covered up with black paint. Oh, and I should point out here that I did paint the tyres with Vallejo Game Heavy Charcoal. This was just to break up all the black on the bike, but I did forget to press record yet again, so sorry about that. Next up is the oil wash. I've made up 2 different mixes here. The first is a simple black wash with Winsor & Newton Lamp Black, and the second is a golden brown wash of Winton Burnt Sienna and a tiny bit of Burnt Umber. This is exactly the same colour of wash that I used in my video for the Vanguard veterans. Both have been diluted with Winsor & Newton Sansador, and starting with the black wash, I apply these into the recesses of the book cover to help fill out that embossed detail. Then I use it to give some shading to the exhaust plate, before applying it liberally to any silver parts like the exhaust pipes, vanes, wheels, and even the tyres. The brown wash I'm going to use on all the skulls, gold, book pages, and the brass areas. Don't be afraid to distribute this so it settles where you need it to, and don't worry about making mistakes either, because remember, you can always easily activate this once it's dry with some Sansador. For the Chaplain rider, I use the black wash to panel line his armour and add some definition between the gold trim and the armour plates. I also apply the black wash to the wax seals, and the rim of the red shoulder pad. Basically anything that would benefit from a black outline. The detail on this emblem is just too small to highlight, but a simple oil wash really helps to make those feathers stand out. And then once again, the brown wash is used on all the areas of gold, bone and parchment. If you want, you can wait for an hour for your first wash to dry before you apply the second, but I found that even if they do mix slightly, it can actually help improve the shading. So after that was allowed to dry overnight, I just gave it another coat of gloss varnish to seal. So to correct the Necro gold, I gave everything that had a flat surface a thin coat of scale 75 Viking gold. I didn't want to cover up my shading with Guilliman flesh or the oil wash completely. Now I could have done this before the wash, but I was worried it would come out too dark again. I think it ended up looking not too bad. Now let's move on to the details. To highlight the skull helmet, I started with a glaze of the base colour, Citadel Wraithbone. My way of doing this was to layer the Wraithbone along the middle top of the part of the cranium, between the side of the helmet and the black metal bracket on top. I allowed each layer to dry before applying the next, and I let it build up into a nice bright highlight. I know this doesn't show up well on camera at this stage. This was about as close as I could get to the camera without my head getting in the way. Trying to avoid the recesses, I reduced the area I painted until I simply was stippling on the Wraithbone, more or less in a line towards the centre of my chosen area. Next, I took some Citadel Shade Seraphim Sepia. Then I simply started to apply the glaze outwards from the shadows over the highlighted area. Again, make sure you've wiped off all the excess on your brush and make the glaze settle where you want it to be by brushing towards that point. Now this does take a little bit of patience, and I do want to do a full video on something like this. But you can see that a nice gradient does eventually start to appear. And don't worry, you can always go back with a Wraithbone glaze if you think you've overdone it. I used this method not only on the helmet, but also on the skull beside the bike seat. For the other skulls, I just gave them a normal thin highlight of Citadel Wraithbone, using Seraphim Sepia if necessary to help balance out any mistakes I'd made. The sealed parchments simply got an edge highlight with their base colour Rakarth Flesh, nothing too fancy. And the wax seals were highlighted with Citadel Wild Rider Red and Jane Stealer Purple. When it came to highlighting the book, I decided to add a couple of drops of Vallejo Bone White to my original paint mix to create two lighter tones. I then applied this to the edges of the embossed cover to give it a more textured look. Now it does look a little strange here because of the paint's texture on the gloss surface, but again, this will be unified with another coat of varnish very soon. The leather parts of the bike were then edge highlighted as I normally do with Citadel Mornfang Brown, but then I stippled on a secondary highlight of Vallejo Game Heavy Brown. Smaller than the first, and this gives it a little bit more depth. Oh, and don't forget the strap and the croziers like I almost did. And the last thing to do at this stage is to give the exhaust a little bit of a muzzle burn. To do that, I simply applied a lopsided coat of Citadel Shade Drakenhof Nightshade, concentrating it more towards the back and at the bottom, kind of at a 45-degree angle. Now it's time to start the edge highlights, so let's begin with the Chaplin. Highlighting dark colours can be difficult, Black tends to show up any mistakes or any imperfections really easily. So I decided to mix Vallejo Dark Sea Blue with some Vallejo Glaze Medium in a 1-to-1 mix. And then I painted this across all the edges of the armour. I only applied 1 or 2 layers because I didn't want it to be fully opaque. This method gives me a little bit of a margin for error when it comes to edge highlighting. If I were to apply the next highlights too thick, for example, then this is going to help soften that gradient. It's subtle, but it really helps once I add an extra edge highlight of undiluted dark sea blue to cover up any gaps or imperfections along those edges. Next I apply an edge highlight of Citadel Thunderhawk Blue. This isn't mixed with a glaze medium, just thinned slightly with water. I tried to keep this highlight smaller and thinner than the dark sea blue, and to areas that would catch the light. Before applying a final highlight of Citadel Fenrisian Grey. This highlight I do keep very small, and restricted to areas that I want it to make it look like it's just caught a glint of light. I gave that 1 coat of AK Interactive Ultramatte varnish to see how it would look. I then painted the lenses with the coat of Vallejo Game Heavy Blue and gave them a highlight of Citadel Loeth Blue, and then added the usual little white dot in the corner. Unfortunately I had to get super close to do this and my head just kept getting in the way of the camera. Once the varnish had time to cure, I then gave all the gold a final edge highlight of Scale 75 Elven Gold, and then the most raised areas I give them an edge highlight of Vallejo Metal Gold. Once again, this is an airbrush paint, so make sure you've wiped off all the excess from your brush. The very last thing I did was take some Citadel Runefang Steel, and on every armour stud I could find, give those a slight dab of paint with the edge of my brush. The ultramatte varnish would just flatten these down too much, and that's why I waited to apply them at this stage. So that's the torso and the legs largely complete. Moving back to the bike, I approached its highlights in a similar way. Mixing even parts of Citadel Layer Dark Reaper and Vallejo Glaze Medium, I edge highlighted any and all black edges I could find. I applied the highlight across the whole edge, but then began to brush the glaze towards the outermost edges. This allowed the paint to settle and it gives me a nice subtle gradient. Again, the secret is to make sure you've wiped off all the excess moisture and paint from your brush. For the second highlight, I take some Citadel Layer Thunderhawk Blue, and again mix it in even parts with Vallejo Glaze Medium. And I set about doing exactly the same thing. I applied a smaller edge highlight, but this time trying to make sure I only moved the brush in one direction, always towards the outermost edges. The glazed Thunderhawk Blue highlight gives me another really good natural gradient. This method is a really good workaround for someone like me who doesn't really have very steady hands and finds it really hard to get progressively thinner edge highlights. Even though it's a bit more time consuming, I think it's really worth it. Finally, I do the same glaze mix with Citadel Layer Fenrisian Grey, and I do another very small edge highlight right towards the sharpest points. I then gave the bike one last coat of gloss varnish to unify all the colours, and once again, the very last thing was to take some Citadel Runefang Steel and very carefully highlight every metal stud I could find on the bike. Unfortunately, my camera setup really just made this impossible to film, but Runefang Steel is a very good paint to do this with. The Vallejo metal range I've used in the past is just too thin and it always overspills. And I left that to cure for about 2 hours. And then I gave it a coat of AK Interactive Ultramatte varnish, and assembled the whole thing onto its base. I just used my normal method for basing and applying the dust weathering to the bike, so I'll link that video in the top right and you can check that out. And with that, I'm done. This was a really fun model to paint, and even though he's mostly black, it took a lot longer to paint than I thought he would. All that detail does take a little bit of time and patience to get right, but boy does it pay off when it hits the tabletop. I think this is my best work yet. I'm really proud of this guy. And I've managed to learn some new skills along the way. So I hope this has given you some ideas on how to paint your own Chaplin or how to highlight black armour. If it has, please consider leaving a like below, or even better, subscribing to the channel for more content like this in the future. And finally, just before I go, one last big thank you to the team at Cult of Paint, who inspired me to take up 40k after a 22-year break. So until next time, remember, enjoy your painting, have fun, and I'll see you soon.